Greetings and welcome to In Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. Now, while we are looking at the International Day of Persons with Disabilities in the rearview mirror, issues still remain to be dealt with. Natalie Andy Silva is the United Nations Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Grant Project Coordinator, and she joins us to speak to work that has been ongoing, its impact, and possibly where we see ourselves in the future or the near to mid-future as a more inclusive society. Thank you for joining us. And let's start off giving us an overview, some of the history, because sometimes we just say, okay, well, this is happening, but we don't necessarily know what would have started it. So take us back to 2021, I believe.
Yes, it is. Sure, certainly. Hi, Dike. Well, going back to a bit of history, this entire project began in 2021 with the expression of interest document that we submitted to the UNPRPD. And that was basically to get the grant funding. So the first part of this entailed an induction workshop, which saw our organization and other partners, other local UN partners, and the Digital Foundation come together, where we hosted a series of online workshops explaining to not just persons with disabilities, but organizations for persons with disabilities, the relevant ministries that they do a lot of work with. So that would have included Ministry of Social Development for the Disability Affairs Unit, the THA, and even right here, Attorney General's Office, Social Development, Prime Minister's Office. There's a lot of them, quite a bit. And from the induction workshop, we went on to the next stage, which entailed us delivering a situational analysis of persons with disabilities across Trinidad and Tobago. So that took us, you would realize that would have been during the pandemic, but we did a lot of research then. The desk research entailed us having to find out the amount of organizations existed here, to look at what was missing, what gaps existed in Trinidad and Tobago, and come up with recommendations. And out of these recommendations, we developed a proposal that was submitted, and Trinidad and Tobago was the only Caribbean country out of a group of 13 to be selected to actually administer the project. So our project deliverables began last year in April. And this entire project, empowering persons with disabilities, no one left behind, and our focus was on awareness, access, and inclusion. So we selected a few target areas, which that is what I'm here about today, because for the past 2 years, our work entailed capacity building for organizations with persons with disabilities, a review of 3 key pieces of legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, being the Equal Opportunity Act, the Mental Health Act, and the Education Act, amongst other things. Our partner organization would have been UNFPA, and they spearheaded the capacity building as well as a review of local programs spearheaded by the United Nations to make sure all of them were inclusive. And also we looked at the method of data standardization. So that's ongoing still, but that is a key part to inform a lot of the projects. They need to capture data, and by capturing data is answering specific questions. So that's just a bit of the background as to why we are here at this stage now.
And thank you so much for that. I don't necessarily want to talk about challenges, but how may have the project looked a little different if it was not, if this data collection was not taking place during the pandemic for the most part?
Well, I don't think, and I agree with you, I didn't see it as a challenge, because during that time, we were able to explore so many different possibilities and bring people together utilizing all the digital platforms available. So we had virtual Zoom sessions with organizations for persons with disabilities. But I would share that if we had not had that at the time, I guess we would have been able to bring together a larger group of people. So at this point now, this year, I could share, because we were able to move around and interact more. So consultants, we got to actually go to some of the organizations and meet with a lot of persons with disabilities who were a very key part of this entire process. So for example, the PSA campaigns that we started included a lot of the actual persons coming physically to talk about experiences. We had so many insightful interviews with them. In the review of everything, they shared their own experiences in proposing ways things could be, things could be recommended to be amended. So I think in as much as it would have been a difficult period, it also gave us a additional boost, some impetus, a lot of virtual work, and we got to meet quite a few more people, right? We got to meet quite a few because even persons who couldn't physically come, but we created so many platforms and avenues for them to participate. And that's a whole part of the inclusion, making sure that they have the access that's needed. So whether persons needed sign language, whether they needed to get easy print and easy read, closed captioning, all of that, we made sure that was provided for them.
And I'm glad that you laid it out like that, because sometimes I can speak for myself, sometimes I may see one side a little easier than the other side. So the fact that the these avenues were able to be created virtually, it kind of offset some of the things that I didn't necessarily want to call challenges in the first place. But because my concern sometimes is that even when you're trying to look for data, there's some data sets that aren't necessarily available at first blush. And you may have an idea of certain people who are visible, but sometimes there are people with disabilities who are not necessarily visible because the family member, the guardians just have them in the house, and they're not really out like that, so people don't necessarily know about them. So that kind of goes down to the importance that I'd like you to speak on, of those groups on the ground who are interacting, engaging with these persons on a daily basis, and they know, okay, this person is here, that person is here, this is what the situation is like. How important is it that you engage with such groupings?
Well, very important, because one thing UNPRPD challenged us to do, and I say that challenge in a good way, they wanted us to acknowledge and reach out to the groups of under-recognized persons. So under-recognized meaning we have a large migrant population in Trinidad, and there are also migrants with disabilities. So we targeted reaching out to the local international migration office here and Living Waters to get access to whom they know as migrants that are persons with disabilities, to have them involved. Then we reached out, we worked closely with the Ministry of Social Development, their Disability Affairs Unit, because they have a database that has at least a listing of 80-something organizations of persons with disabilities. So they're registered NGOs. Not all of them may be led by a person with disability, but they're all doing the same work. So learning about so much of these groups and being able to contact them all added to the importance of the data gathering, because it's finding where these persons are located, age groups they are in, how whether it's male or female. So the gender aspect of it is even larger. And then when you met some of these groups out there, some of them that we didn't even think of and we didn't know existed in different parts of Trinidad. So the biggest help was through social development, because they do have an extensive database. And then even persons with disabilities shared with us groupings that they knew of or who they interacted with, and we were able to even add onto our database and have that extensive reach to get persons to participate. And trust me, they've all been so enthusiastic and excited to know that people are doing things. They're willing to share their stories. They're just excited for the fact that for once people are taking inclusion seriously, and it's something that's really needed. And the more it's done, so our society will become a very inclusive one.
And there are two things I want to get on, but the first one, you said Trinidad. That includes Tobago?
Yes,
As in
it is.
Trinidad and Tobago. I get
And
nervous
Tobago.
sometimes when they say one name calling.
It's definitely Trinidad and Tobago, because, for example, one part of the project, we had to review the process of rehabilitation and access to assistive technology programs. So our consultants and myself, we went to Tobago. We had interviews with different organizations there. We worked with the Division of Aging, under which the Disability Affairs Unit falls in Tobago. We met with the Secretary of Health. We went to the hospitals to find out more on those who deal with therapists. There are different groups. So even on our legislative review committee, for example, one of the groups based in Tobago was very much represented on that, and even on our steering committee. So we made sure that it included at every step of the way Trinidad and Tobago. Capacity building, we had to ensure that we did it both in Trinidad and Tobago, because it's a twin island state, and we can't do for one and not the other. It's one country, and we have to report on inclusion and project activities in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you very much, because I'm not even waiting for somebody to beat me. I beat myself if I didn't ask that question or ask for that clarification, that nuance. And
Very
even
true.
the way that we're talking about inclusion, but you would have spoken about some of those groupings that you got from blind ministries, you got from different areas, and they were so enthusiastic to say that, okay, this is happening. What kind of feedback were you getting from them? Because I think sometimes, well, all too often, there's this occasion where something is rolled out, and then the people who are doing the work and would better help to inform, if they engage on the front end, they say, I guess this is what we have to work with, even though we'll grumble and deal with it. What's some of the feedback you're getting from, so that people can give their input before things are rolled out, before things are crafted, things that they would need to deal with after is made public?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because from the onset, one part of this project entailed making sure that the people who we interact with and get recommendations from and share was the grouping of persons we are targeting, which is the persons with disabilities. So our steering committee and all the groups and committees we established had representation, not just say UN agencies or NGOs or the United Nations bodies, but we targeted specifically organizations for persons with disabilities, and even reached out to some groups that are representing them, like parent support groups, so they could share their feedback. So if we're doing, like, in the process of the situation analysis, before we finalized and submitted our documents, we made sure and share it with all these groups, so they could have been a part with it and be sure this is what they're on board and this is what they're saying. Every step of the way entailed consultations with them. This part where we're becoming excited about it with the PSA campaigns, where they're talking about proposed recommendations. Everything that was put forward was led by a group. That group entailed representatives from the Ministry of Social Development, Attorney General's Office, Education, Ministry of Health, and then different groupings of persons with disabilities. So they got to share, and they've been so excited about people actually listening to them. They were challenged to, and again, challenged in a good way, because the chair of that committee challenged them. Okay, you raised something that was an issue or challenge for you. How do you then formulate that into a recommendation that would now assist you? So everyone had their input, and before that document is submitted, again, we go to our steering committee, and the head of that steering committee is actually the executive chairman of the Blind Welfare Association, Kenneth Surratt. So it's all, the entire project has been inclusive, and I can share so much of these NGOs have been so grateful for the work being done, and they want so much more out of it. So when we start to air these different campaigns, you will understand why it's so important and how powerful the messages are and how it impacts them, because they feel so grateful to be given that voice and to be given the airplay now to share so much more on what they've been going through, and how we as a society can make them feel a bigger part of it, because
I
we're
think
all the
some
same.
I think sometimes the work that is being done now validates the work that has been done. But we
Correct.
continue, but we continue the conversation when we return. Stay with us. We come back after this. Welcome back. We are speaking with Natalie Andy Silva, the United Nations Partnership on Rights of Persons with Disabilities Grand Project Coordinator. And I said that in one breath, I'm feeling proud of myself. Now, even looking at we just took that break, and we were talking about, you just started on the PSA campaign. You also spoke a little bit about the Legislative Review Committee. I'd like you to take up there a little more, please, because even like when you mentioned Kenneth Surratt, he's not he is not unfamiliar with helping to determine policy. So what are some of these things that were spoken about in terms of, like, how did you go about having input to say, okay, well, these are things that we want to address in these 3 points of law, I believe?
All right. That's actually, it was a very interesting process. So out of the situation analysis, 4 acts were looked at, and 4 acts were actually suggested by members that we review. From those, we put together a legislative review committee, and when I say put together, invitation letters were sent out to the ministries to ask them to recommend someone. And then based on our 2 years, this is from 2000 and 2021 to now, we looked at key persons who we thought would be a big part of this process, who could be integral and bringing the information covering different groupings. So CODO, for example, that's the Consortium of Disability Organizations in Trinidad. They're a body that represents practically all of the NGOs in Trinidad for persons with disabilities. So they were one part, and we reached out to them to have them on board. Now, keep in mind, they were part of our project from inception. So all of these groupings were keen to be a part of it and see how they can now make a difference. So for the Legislative Review Committee, it began first by, okay, these are the acts we're looking at. How do we then go about this process? And the main thing was to look at the legislations against the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to see how best our laws align with that. And when I say, why I say align, we are signed on to this convention. So the different gaps. And one thing we looked at and participants kept mentioning throughout all the research and data we were doing and gathering is that there was only mere mention in everything of persons with disabilities, and we speak to them as vulnerable populations, and we don't really identify them. And vulnerable groups are not just persons with disabilities. It's the migrant population, it's the age, it's children. So it's a lot of things. So they found that it needed to be specifically defined. The chair of the committee found a creative way to do this, where he set up something like a matrix document where each article was looked at and against the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we had those meetings every month to go through step by step each article. So there was an ongoing discussion. Persons will come and share what they thought, if this aligned, if something was missing. And this is where the experiences, lived experiences always came into play. And I can share, we learned a lot out of this, because some of the things you and I think of, we've never experienced, but persons with disabilities may have experienced it. And they were so helpful towards guiding and creating the recommendations in how something could be crafted. And those were put forward, and then everyone sat together to make sure this is what it is we really want to see, and that we really want this put forward. This law should be amended. And mind you, these are the recommendations we are putting forward, because we can't actually draft the laws. So we are recommending what change should come into play. We put together that list. It was shared after the Legislative Review Committee reviewed it and said, yes, this is what we want. It was then shared with our steering committee for their review and their approval before it came back to PAHO now for our director here to sign off and submit.
I
So
think it's
that was the
important being able to do something like that. And because sometimes you may say, okay, well, we engaged a group, but
yeah,
that group may have its specific agenda, things that it is advocating for. And
correct.
it is so, and it's hard sometimes to start the whole process going again, because then you have
Yeah.
another group with another interest saying, okay,
And
but you
that
didn't
is,
take this into consideration. And
mhm.
it feels as though it can be wasting time, as opposed to
It
what
does.
seems happened in the sense that it may take a little longer, but you get all players on board so that when you
Mhm.
have recommendations to put forward, it encompasses most, if not almost all, of what there
Correct.
is.
And correct. And for that, I would say we are so grateful for the chair of that committee, he played the biggest role in keeping persons on track, because like you shared, navigating this has been the most interesting part, because just like everyone else, different groups have different agendas. Persons with disabilities, they all have their own peculiar, well, I shouldn't say peculiar, they have different disabilities. So each group advocates for themselves. So in the beginning, it was a reminder to let everyone know that this is not just about your group. This is everyone. We're trying to make sure this inclusion is for everybody. So yes, I appreciate you bringing to the table what has affected you. But when crafting recommendations or putting forward proposal, it has to be for the larger group, not just the individuals. So it works to encompass all. And they were really, really good at doing that. So that was one thing I could share, was one of the best positives coming out of this project. And I do hope people really take on board what recommendations are being made as we work towards building more awareness in Trinidad and making it an inclusive society.
And I think we're working towards having another conversation, but in the last 30 seconds, Ms. De Silva, what kind of timelines are we looking for? What's the next step?
Well, our next step is submitting these recommendations, both with the assistive technology and rehabilitation, and the proposed recommendations to the relevant ministries for their review, and hopefully they go further. But we're not stopping there because we embarked on building like our own awareness campaign, sharing both on social media and across all media platforms, a bit of why you must see persons with disabilities. So we are hoping within the next 2 weeks to be able to start sharing that information. Look out for it on Paho Caribbean social media sites and hopefully on the television stations where our documentaries and PSAs will be aired, so you can hear more about the recommendations coming out and why persons with disabilities are advocating so much for this change that will bring much needed inclusion and awareness for them.
And thank you so much, Grand Projects Coordinator for the United Nations Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Natalie and De Silva. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.